Okay, good morning. I suppose I need to make a disclaimer to start with. I'm not a natural scientist, and I'm not any kind of an angler, despite wearing a shirt covered in fish by way of camouflage. I'm a town planner and historian. I work for Sheffield City Council and have done for about 30 odd years. And I work in regeneration. And I suppose if I've got anything to recommend me, it is that I try to weave river restoration into as much of my regeneration work as was politically acceptable over the last 25 to 30 years. And as a result of that, I chair something called the Sheffield Waterways Strategy Group, which I'll explain a bit about its role, because I think it's quite important in what's happened in Sheffield. I've also been very fortunate to work with some very talented landscape architects and engineers, two of whom I'm pleased to see are with us today, Sam and Rick, and you'll see some of their work in these pictures. More recently this year, I've been lucky enough to be involved in the setting up of a new trust, the Sheaf and Porter Trust, which I'll talk about towards the end of the presentation, because I think it's brought some great energy in terms of engaging the public with the rivers that we're all passionate about, but which sometimes are literally unseen and out of mind. But first of all, just a little bit of history, because I am a historian, so you don't get over without a bit of history, I'm afraid, with me. These are Sheffield's rivers. If you're not familiar with the city, we call it a city of rivers because really Sheffield is not a great place to build a city, and if it wasn't for the water power from the 5 principal rivers, I doubt if there would have been a settlement there. So what you're looking at here is the main river, which is the Don. That's the canal there, and then you've got the Loxley, Rivelin, Porter and Sheaf, all converging on the centre of the city here. As you can see, about a third of the city boundary, which is what this is showing here, is actually moorland, and this is actually the national park. So this is the Peak Park. I don't think there's any other city that has a third of its area in a national park. But the other thing I want to point out to you is this feature here, where the Porter and the Sheaf, when they get to the edge of the city centre, effectively disappear. It's not quite true. There are one or two little places where they appear, which we'll see in more detail, but effectively they disappear. Now, all of these rivers were industrial rivers from the sort of 16th, 17th century, gradually building up to a crescendo at the end of the 18th century. And this little map down here, if it's clear enough, it appears bigger later on, shows you some idea of the complexity of the water management that was in place at the height of water power at the beginning of the 19th century. All these little dams and goits and connecting streams made it a very complex and highly managed, although ecologically not at all great, system. And during the late 19th century and early 20th century, gradually water power was superseded by steam and other forms of motive power, and the industrial use of these rivers started to retreat from the west. So by the beginning of the 20th century, rivers like the Rivelin here, which was a former industrial river, that's a weir that was set up to power a small grinding shop, were being reclaimed for public space by a combination of the activities of a corporation who bought up land and sites because they wanted to build reservoirs in some of the valleys, so they wanted to buy off people that would oppose that because they had an interest in the water power, and also charitable bequests. Several of the big industrialists bought up sections of the valleys and made them into parks and then gave them to the city. So if you're familiar with it, parks like Bingham Park, Aincliffe Park, Millhouses, Graves Park, came about in that way. And this was built into the plans, town plans of Sheffield quite early on in the century. The first formal town plan for Sheffield, 1921, the ABERCROMBIE plan, actually identified this idea of river parkways. So that was kind of a strong planning idea, but it only applied to the west side of the city, which by no coincidence is where the better off people live. So it's quite a socially divided city. On the west side, you get the wealthier suburbs. On the east and the north, you get the poorer suburbs, the heavy industry. So different story entirely during the 20th century to the north and east and in the city centre, where the River Don and Sheaf and Porter became completely encased really in heavy industry. And I always challenge people, this is a picture of the Lower Don Valley, Attercliffe, people know it, to find anything that's growing on that picture. There might be an aspidistra, but otherwise it is completely hard. And here's the River Don going through the middle of it here, but nothing growing on there at all, because it was one of the dirtiest rivers in Europe and completely dead, both flora and fauna. And this is what it looked like on the ground. You know, this is 1945. This is in the 1970s. This is well within my working life. And really the main factors that turned that round were the construction of this sewer that you can see, new sewer, 1985. Difficult to get the scale of that, but that is a sewer big enough to drive a double-decker bus down. It's the biggest tunnelling operation in Europe in its day. So that actually picked up all the sewers that were flowing into the Don and took them down to a sewage treatment plant. So that had a massive impact on water quality, and obviously the decline of the steelworks, heavy industry, and the better regulation of it also contributed as well. So that in the 1980s, you saw this recovery of the river, quite rapid, and this coincided with the early days of the urban ecology movement, which had some heroes in Sheffield, including a guy called Ollie Gilbert, who was an urban ecologist, who surveyed the River Don very early on and highlighted the fact that this river that everyone had written off was actually now springing back to life. Also a guy called Mike Wild, who helped us set up the Sheffield Wildlife Trust. Out of that came an initiative called the Five Weirs Walk Trust, which I helped to found. And I suppose what makes me a slightly odd fish in local government is, although I've always been a local government officer, I've always had one foot in the voluntary sector, because my belief is that you need to have those 2 feet to actually make projects like this really work and take root. So along with Rick, who's here as well, we approached the Chamber of Commerce and the Wildlife Trust and proposed the setting up of a trust to open up the River Don to public access in the East End of Sheffield. Most people have forgotten the river was even there. Through over about 20 years, through a combination of planning gain, i.e. getting developers to put in sections of walkway and river improvement, public funded projects, whether it's Europe, whether it was by the Development Corporation, charitable fundraising, and negotiating with the landowners for them to give away their riverbanks, something that I don't think they would ever have done if the council had asked them to do it, but they were perfectly happy to do it if a charitable trust asked them. So we actually built about 7.5 kilometres of riverside walk, and we only had to buy one very small piece of land off one very obdurate landowner. And this is the kind of transformation that took place in terms of opening it to public access, actually in the process picking up lots of unknown outfalls that people had forgotten about, but which came up when we started to put the gabions in to build the walkway, and also kind of restoring the riverside environment for access. In this case, this was actually a wheelchair fishing path. And in the process, celebrating the river and actually kind of celebrating the culture of it and doing all kinds of odd things down on the riverside that actually kind of took people down there and brought the river back to their notice. And one of the things that the Trust did was to build the very first fish pass on the Don in 2004. And I'll pick that story up a bit later on. There were 22 weirs on the River Don. The first fish pass was put in by the Five Weirs Trust. the Trust also partnered with a number of inner city communities, Afro-Caribbean community, Asian community, to build sections of the walk. So it was trying to bring in people who would not otherwise necessarily think that the river was something of their concern. And in the process also commissioned some quite innovative engineering. This is called the Cobweb Bridge, and this was a device, again, Rick came up with the concept originally, of how to get a public walkway through a listed railway bridge which you weren't allowed to touch, and at the same time not obstruct the flow of the river. And so the solution that Rick and other engineers came up with was to hang the river from the soffit of the bridge by stainless steel wire, and that's why it's called the Cobweb Bridge or Spider Bridge. And you can't see it very well, but the lighting on the picture on the right hand side are actually big stainless steel spiders. Out of that whole experience came an emerging partnership with the Environment Agency, the City Council, and we started to draw other interested voluntary bodies in, and we set up something called the Waterways Strategy Group that still works today, 14 years later, and brings in an increasing number of voluntary, community and public agencies to kind of set ambitions and strategy for waterways across the city. And I do think that's a really important thing, because there's no one, as you all know, no one agency that has any complete sort of hegemony over waterways. It's this quite muddly British system we've got, where riparian owners and local authorities and the Environment Agency and Yorkshire Water, or the water companies, all have, and Canal and River Trust, all have bits of the picture, but no one has the whole picture. So Waterways Strategy Group has a shared vision. It brings together public, private and voluntary sectors. It looks for partnership opportunities. It tries to maximise local knowledge, which is vast. It harnesses skills and research that might include the universities, for instance, very often, or local organisations. It encourages debate, because there's no one right definition of what a regenerated river is. Every interest group has a different perspective on it, and so there's got to be negotiation there. But it tries to take a holistic approach, looking across all aspects of the rivers, and out of that hopefully comes multifunctional investment. It has a strategy which main principles are people at the heart, but also recognising that rivers can be a setting for investment, that there is an absolute priority now for adapting our rivers to climate change, that rivers are also important in the city's image, for celebrating heritage. Continuous public access is something which we champion, because that's how you actually draw people in the first place. We believe very strongly in river stewardship as being something that there needs to be a dedicated river stewardship presence, one that isn't entirely dependent on volunteers. And we look to restore wildlife habitats. And we publish a 5-year action plan, which is non-binding on the members. It's not like it's a statutory thing, but it does bring initiatives together. And so here's some examples. This is one we're promoting the rivers as sustainable transport routes, cycling and walking, obviously, into the city centre. Massive wake-up call came in 2007 for Sheffield, when the city centre and the Don Valley were catastrophically flooded. This is actually a street. The River Don is over to the right there, and you can see where it's breaking its banks and pouring into the street. We hadn't seen floods like this for decades and decades, and this really woke people up to the fact that climate change was here, and we were not managing or defending our riverbanks. Top right there is a picture of the River Don, more or less in the same location, obviously on a less wet day. And we were all celebrating the fact that the River Don had come back to life. It was covered in trees, and it was a green corridor. Actually, this was an accident waiting to happen, because you can't have an urban river that is that obstructed by cracked willows and islands and so on. So there was a huge kind of reappraisal of the need to actively manage the river in a way it hadn't really been done since the days of water power. So one of the things that came out of that was flood defences. And here's an example where a flood defence was put in on Nursery Street, right in the city centre. Again, it's the same spot where you saw the river breaking its banks just now, but it's actually cunningly disguised as a riverside park. So actually what most people see is a nice green space that allows you for the first time to get down to the bank, the water. You can put kayaks in here, you can fish, you can just enjoy the water. But along the back edge of it is actually quite a substantial flood wall, but there's no barrier to actually enjoying the river. Also out of that initiative came something called the River Stewardship Company, which I think is still unique in the UK. It's a social enterprise. It's set up to provide stewardship services to riparian owners through a team of permanent full-time stewards, and individual firms can pay for that. But actually, after 2007, what came about was a mechanism for funding that more constructively. For the first time ever, I think, anywhere in the country, we use something called the Business Improvement District, which is a device that's normally applied to town centres for kind of keeping streets clean and promoting town centres, but there's nothing in the legislation that says you can't use it for a river. So we actually had a ballot of all the riparian owners on the Lower Don Valley stretch of the river. We got a majority in favour of it, and they paid a levy on top of their business rates to support stewardship for 5 years, and actually contributed a capital sum to the flood defence. That arrangement has actually come to an end now, and it's a rather slightly simplified version of that now, where only the major riparian owners now pay into that fund. But the principle of getting riparian owners to pay for maintenance, motivated by flood defence, but also acknowledging that there were environmental and habitat and community benefits also to be covered in that, is an important one. So that brings us to the Sheaf and Porter. The Sheaf and Porter are those two missing rivers in that slide I showed you at the beginning. Missing because, well, several reasons. As water power gave over to steam power, the river Sheaf and Porter became intolerably polluted. Quite small rivers, factories crowding in on them, sewage going into the river, the slaughterhouses going, all the effluent going into the river. They became a massive health hazard. And so in the 1860s, which is the time of the big stink in London, which I'm sure you've all heard of, when houses of Parliament had to be closed down because the River Thames was so noxious, up in Sheffield, what happened was the Midland Railway arrived, and they wanted somewhere to build a station, and they said, well, the only place we can find to build it is in the Sheaf Valley, but unfortunately it's going to mean culverting over the River Sheaf and part of the Porter. And the local citizenry said, yes, please. How soon can you do it? And so that's what happened. The river was culverted over for about 1 kilometre. Other parts of the Sheaf were canalised, and then that set off a process of further abuse of the river, which continued right up until the 1920s. That slide there is actually one of the last bits of culverting done in concrete. And we'll come back to that particular section a bit later on. So essentially, the River Sheaf and Porter disappeared from central Sheffield, particularly unfortunate in terms of the Sheaf, because that's what the Sheffield's named after, the Sheaf Field, and disappeared into this network of culverts. There's a selection of them. In particular, as I said, the original foundation site of Sheffield is where the Sheaf and Don meet. This is where Sheffield Castle was built, and where the centre of the city was for the next 800 years. But that's completely unexplained now, because the River Sheaf, where you can see it marked on the slide, is quite invisible there. This part of the city, Castlegate, is now undergoing regeneration. It's been very hard hit by closure of retail, and the market's being moved away and so on. And the River Sheaf is a key kind of ingredient in recreating the sense of place of this area, and recreating Sheffield's kind of water landscape. Back on the Porter, the other tributary, an opportunity arose to do a demonstration scheme to show how this quite small river could be transformed. The council bought this site, and we managed to get funding from the Environment Agency and from Planning Gain Section 106 to create a little pocket park. On the little slide at the side there, you can see what it looked like before. Part of it was canalised and part of it was actually completely culverted over and invisible. And through this nice design that Sam and his colleagues were responsible for, we profiled the banks, created an access down to the river, and then with the help of Paul and his team, they helped us to actually renaturalise the bed, to recreate something like a natural riverbed. The river is actually paved here, like a cobbled street with a dry water flow channel in the middle. So people find it very hard to believe this was the same river that they enjoyed in their parks. When we did this, everyone kind of took a double take. Wow, is that the same river? The restoration of the habitat was spectacular, to the point where Paul can do his party trick, jumping in the river, getting his little rod out, and usually catches a trout in here within about 2 or 3 minutes, which astonishes people. So although it is quite a small part of the river, the impact of doing this on kind of public opinion and awareness, and indeed the willingness of the Environment Agency to help was massive. And so it was at that point that some of us took the decision to launch a new trust called the Sheaf and Porter Trust, to actually build on that example and the opportunities that are arising all the way up and down those two rivers, to actually put the Sheaf back into Sheffield and the Porter, which is our sort of strapline. Some of the reasons for doing it now: more and more people living in our city centres. Sheffield's no exception. Although Sheffield's known as a green city, the city centre is not green. It's got quite a paucity of green space, so that's a strong reason. Climate change is probably the biggest one. The culverts are simply not a practicable way of managing rivers in the extreme weather conditions that we're getting. They block up very easily. Biodiversity, as we know, is plummeting worldwide. There's no better way of promoting rapid increase in biodiversity than reopening and renaturalising a river. Rivers give a sense of place, and that's something we've really tapped into. That's something that we perhaps had underestimated, how important that factor was. And also Sheffield is now promoting itself not just as the steel city, but as the outdoor city, a place where you can enjoy outdoor sports like kayaking, climbing, skiing, not just in the countryside, but right in the centre of the city. And so our aims chime very well with that. So how did we launch the new trust? I think this is where perhaps some of the ideas you may find useful to take away and discuss. We circulated colleagues and allies through the Waterways Strategy Group and other organisations. We had some planning meetings, and then we linked up with something called the Sheffield Adventure Film Festival, which is quite a big annual event where all kinds of adventurous sports are tried out and promoted through short films. We thought, would it be possible to actually explore some of the culverts as part of this Adventure Film Festival? People have been interested in visiting these culverts for years, but we'd always been blocked by kind of the usual health and safety arguments. You need to go on a 2-week confined spaces course before you can go down there. And then thinking laterally with the Adventure Film Festival guys, we said, well, these are just caves basically, so let's actually contact some caving experts, which we did through the Youth Hostels Association. There's lots of caving experts in Sheffield because of the Derbyshire Caves, and we got a team of trained guides with insurance who said, having explored the culverts, yes, we can take parties down. And so we launched the trust then with a series of these culvert visits over one weekend, and then we showed a film called Lost Rivers at a public showing. Any of you familiar with that? Caroline Backley? It's a Canadian filmmaker. It's a great film. I really urge you to watch it. It's about the worldwide movement of rediscovering hidden rivers from North America to Southeast Asia. And it's inspirational, and it shows that we are not alone in what we're doing in the UK. It's something that's happening worldwide. we packed out the largest room in the local cinema, the showroom cinema, 250 odd people. 60 people actually joined the trust on the spot, and from that we've gone from strength to strength. What we're offering people is a vision, I think, of how the rivers could contribute in lots of different ways that I've already mentioned. We're offering to increase public access, to deculvert sections, to renaturalise parts of the river where we can opportunistically, to build up the stewardship activities, to supply interpretation, and to mark the course of the river where we can't immediately deculvert it. There's already a design, sketch design that's being prepared by Sam and his colleagues for how you could deculvert that section of the River Sheaf. And that section of the River Sheaf it consists of two different structures. In the foreground, that rather dramatic space there is what was commonly known by urban explorers as the MEGATRON, and was built for the trams back in the 1890s. It's a very solid blue brick engineering structure. Beyond that is the section that you saw being constructed in those black and white photos, and that is a concrete, reinforced concrete culvert, much lower, which is actually deteriorated quite badly. So in fact, the council who owns that bit of the culvert has either got to repair it or take it out. So obviously we're pushing for it to be taken out. And below there is the sketch idea of how that part of the river could be turned into something called the Sheaf Field, which would be a park celebrating where Sheffield began and bordering on the ruins of the Sheffield Castle. And that's another view of it, showing you how the river could be renaturalised there as well. But it's a sketch design at the moment, and it's not funded. So this is a major project that the Sheaf and Porter Trust are going to partner with the Environment Agency and the Council to achieve, probably by a heritage lottery bid, in my view. That's how it could possibly relate to the Sheffield Castle ruins. That's one sketch. Nothing's been finalised on that yet. Another opportunity that exists is the station, I've referred to already, is going to have to be remodelled if HS2 happens, or even if HS2 doesn't happen and Northern Power Rail happens, which is probably more desirable, the station has got to be remodelled. What we want to make sure of through the Trust is that the river benefits out of that in some way. We're not going to move the station, but we want to make sure that there are some benefits to the river, in particular this section of the River Porter running into the station, which at the moment is a typical canalised, pretty sterile environment, could be renaturalised, perhaps something like this. So that, you know, part of the Trust role is to influence these kind of big planning decisions and to be the voice of the river. And then all the way up the River Porter, there are development sites at the moment where people are either redeveloping or converting the old cutlery factories into mainly flats, but some workspace as well. And again, the Trust is there to influence those planning decisions and to make sure that the river actually benefits both in terms of public access and renaturalisation. That's what this section looks like at the moment, so there's plenty of scope to actually improve it. Here on that section is where the river's actually deculverted itself. This is a car park for DECATHLON, the sports goods multinational. Their car park just collapsed in the middle of the night, and lo and behold, there was the river underneath it. We were able to apply sort of public pressure to DECATHLON because of their image, the fact that they are an outdoor company. They agreed not to just replace the car park, but to actually formalise that section of the deculverted river. And hopefully in the future they're thinking about redeveloping their site, and we may be able to persuade them to actually extend that deculverting across the whole site. So we've started to engage with, you know, quite a powerful multinational company at the local level to improve the river that they sit on. And again, this just an example, just downstream from DECATHLON, that's the car park you can see on the bottom left. Quite large residential developments that are now committed to renaturalising and improving sections of the river, which is in their interest as well, because it's easy to sell flats looking out over a pleasant renaturalised river than it is a concrete channel. the initial weekend of tours that we did back in, when it was March, I think, this year, we thought, well, we'll stage a few more of these culvert tours. So we put them online on Eventbrite, and they were booked up within minutes. And since then, we've been doing these tours every weekend, 4 tours a day, Saturday and Sunday, throughout August, July and September. So I think about 700 people have now been down with us into the culverts. More than that. And each person paying £15 a time. Some people have been down 3 times. I don't think we remotely anticipated how attractive and popular this activity would be. We thought it would appeal to people that had a particular interest in the history and the environment. People actually do it for all kinds of other reasons, for existential reasons, I would say. Either conquering their fear of confined spaces, or spiders, or rats, or whatever, or celebrating their birthday, or it's just become a hot ticket. But it creates an audience for our message, and then substantial numbers of those people go away and say, yeah, actually I'd like to get involved with this. This is something that I can see the point of. So it's been a fantastic way of engaging with a new audience for rivers. Obviously, it raises all kinds of issues about habitat improvement. We do have single crayfish down there, for instance. We do have trout, as Paul has said. We don't have salmon yet, but we are only now one final fish pass away from a complete fish passage from the Humber right through to the historic spawning grounds of the Dom. But we also have bats down there as well, Dormington bats. And they are one species that could be the loser in a deculverting exercise. But what the tours have done is allowed us to have quite a kind of grown-up discussion with the bat groups in South Yorkshire. People have always thought that they would just oppose anything that let light into the culverts. Actually, they've turned out to be quite a bit more considered than that. And they've been on our tours, and they're now going to be part of the group that we're going to do a workshop on how we create the Sheffield Park. And we've got quite a good dialogue now going with them. So actually the tours have been a great way to engage with environmentalists and other people who have got a shared interest in the river.
So it's 1,500 people.
1,500, thank you. One of the issues, and it's already come up in the discussion this morning, is where we can't realistically remove the culverts completely, like under the station. Can we get light down into them? Can we actually make people aware of the river at least? And this is a nice example that we discovered through the tours. This is underneath the station, and it's a clear hatch that was created, I think, to let plant down into the river. But everyone had forgotten about it, including the railway companies. But Anthony discovered it on platform 5A in the station. That's the little slide there. It's just a wooden trapdoor, basically, and it goes straight down into the river. So we're now talking to the train company that runs the station, who seem quite receptive to the idea of opening that up and putting some kind of glazed structure in there. And Rick has already come up with a design for it, which is quite nice. Would start to put the river back into people's attention at a place where lots of people stand around waiting for trains. And we've identified 3 or 4 more locations where light wells could quite easily be put down into the river in quite a short term. So that's one of the projects we're now working on. We're also talking to the kayakers, because that's another very active group in the city, about whether it's possible to perhaps create a standing wave or some kind of whitewater feature on one of the deculverted sections. And again, that's something that we're due to discuss in 3 or 4 weeks' time at a workshop. This is one in Munich, on a not very big river actually, which is a massive tourist attraction now in the city. And there is a place where there is currently a weir. Maybe take the weir out and put something like this in. We're looking for the feasibility of that. We're also working with people like street artists to create a kind of culture around the river, and to some extent to discourage graffiti as well. And then on the basis of the public interest that we've now generated, we're able to deploy really impressive numbers of volunteers. So this was an event that took place weekend before last. It's World Cleanup Day. So this is a cleanup of a section of the river that runs through a park in one of the suburbs of Sheffield. The river is almost invisible in the park at the moment, and has been the subject of a lot of fly tipping and dumping. So the Trust, along with the River Stewardship Company and DECATHLON, actually organised a clean-up. We got nearly 100 people turned out. It's probably about the biggest clean-up the River Stewards have ever done, I think. A terrific response. On the same day, it was also our Waterways Festival, and so in order to make an impact on the crowds of people heading down to the Canal Basin for the Waterways Festival, we decided to put the river back in paint on Exchange Street next door to where we're hoping to create the Sheffield Park. We did this with poster paint. We just did it overnight, and then the next morning we invited people passing by, kids, families, etc., to draw what they thought might be in the river under their feet. It was a terrifically simple but effective way of drawing attention to the message we're trying to get across. And although this was just done in temporary materials of poster paint and chalk, I think it's had such an impact that we're now going to go back to the council and try and persuade them to let us do it in more permanent materials. So that's just some examples of what we're doing in Sheffield with the Sheaf and Porter Trust and our partners. I hope that stimulates you and gives you some food for thought. The important principles, I think, are having a mechanism to create these voluntary public business partnerships, make connections with the public, use all the media. All these events have been largely social media based. We've not really had to rely much on the press or TV or radio. Be opportunistic. The things that interest you about the river may not be the things that interest the rest of the broad public. There is an irony, obviously, in the success of these culvert tours, because actually what we're set up to do is to get rid of them. But nevertheless, it's a way of getting people's attention and actually focusing on the issue. And once you've got their attention, then you can get your message across. If you don't have their attention, it's a non-starter. And also looking for multiple benefits. So, how can we devise river restoration schemes that also contribute to regeneration, might improve the value of the site, obviously can contribute to flood defence and climate change resilience, and weave all those things together and therefore build up the political and funding support to actually achieve what we want to achieve. So, that's it. Any questions?